Commander's cupola of his Panther tank, watching the Norman countryside burn under a steel gray sky that promised nothing but death. 4 hours, that was all the time left. Before the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, his division would cease to exist as a fighting force. The thunderous roar of Allied artillery rolled across the hedgerows like an endless storm, each explosion sending columns of earth and fire skyward. Meyer's throat was raw from shouting orders into the radio, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the morning chill. This was not how panzer commanders were supposed to die, trapped in the killing fields of Normandy, watching their divisions bleed out one tank at a time. According to military historians and documentation from the National Archives, the situation facing Meyer and the German armored forces in Normandy during early July 1944 represented one of the most desperate tactical scenarios of the Western Front. The Allied breakout operation, known as Operation Charmwood, had begun its devastating assault on Caen just hours earlier, and Meyer's division stood directly in its path. Meyer had received the orders at 0300 hours, hold the line at all costs, prevent the British Second Army from breaking through to Carpiquet airfield. Simple orders for an impossible task. His division, once comprising over 15,000 men and 150 tanks, had been ground down to fewer than 30 operational panzers and perhaps 4,000 exhausted soldiers. The remainder lay scattered across the Norman fields, burned hulks of metal that had once been Tiger and Panther tanks, men buried in shallow graves or simply left where they fell. The young commander, only 33 years old, but already a legend among the SS Panzer Corps, had fought across Poland, France, the Balkans, and the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He had seen terrible things, done terrible things, survived things that should have killed him a dozen times over, but nothing compared to this grinding attrition, this methodical destruction of his command by an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. Through his binoculars, Meyer watched the horizon darken with the approach of British armor. Sherman tanks, dozens of them, rolling forward in coordinated waves behind a curtain of artillery fire. Above them, somewhere in the clouds, Allied fighter bombers circled like vultures, waiting for any German vehicle foolish enough to move in daylight. His radio crackled with desperate transmissions from subordinate commanders. Ammunition running low, casualties mounting, entire companies reduced to squads. Meyer lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. 0700 hours. By 1100 hours, if the Allied advance maintained its current pace, his division would be encircled, destroyed, or forced into a chaotic retreat that would accomplish the same result. For hours to preserve some remnant of the unit he had commanded with such pride. For hours to make decisions that would determine whether his men lived as prisoners or died as statistics. For hours before everything he had built, everything he had fought for, ceased to exist. The young panzer commander climbed down from the cupola and gathered his officers for what might be their final council of war. The command post occupied a partially collapsed Norman farmhouse 3 kilometers south of Carpiquet. Meyer's operations officer, Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Beck, had spread maps across a splintered dining table while smoke from a damaged chimney filled the room. With an acrid haze, 7 officers crowded into the small space battalion commanders, reconnaissance leaders, artillery coordinators, all bearing the same expression of exhausted determination. These were not the fresh-faced soldiers who had marched into Poland in 1939. These were veterans, survivors, men who had learned to measure their lives in hours rather than years. Gentlemen, Meyer began without preamble, tapping the map with a blackened finger. The British will reach our main defensive line by 0900 hours. They outnumber us 5 to 1 in armor, 10 to 1 in infantry, and they control the skies completely. High Command has denied our request for withdrawal. We are ordered to hold until relieved. A bitter laugh escaped from Sturmbannführer Hans Waldmüller, commander of what remained of the division's Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Relieved by whom? The 12th SS is shattered. The 21st Panzer has been fighting continuously for 4 weeks. Who exactly is coming to save us? Obersturmbannführer. Meyer met his subordinate's eyes without flinching. The question deserved an honest answer. No one is coming. We hold because those are our orders, and because every hour we delay the British here is one more for the 7th Army to establish defenses to the south. He paused, letting that reality sink in. But I did not gather you here to read you orders you already know. I gathered you because we have for hours to accomplish what High Command has given us an entire day to do. Beck leaned forward, his scarred hands tracing lines on the map. The British attack pattern has been predictable. Heavy artillery preparation, followed by infantry advance with tank support, then consolidation before the next push. They are methodical. cautious afraid of our remaining panzers even though they outnumber us significantly. Historical records from British military archives confirm this assessment. Following the costly battles of June 1944, British commanders had adopted increasingly cautious tactics when facing German armor, even when intelligence suggested German forces were severely depleted. Then we used their caution against them, Meyer said, his voice gaining intensity. We cannot win a defensive battle. They will simply flatten our positions with artillery and roll over whatever remains. But we can delay them, confuse them, make them think we are stronger than we are. Obersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, whose reconnaissance battalion had been reduced to fewer than 200 men, studied the map thoughtfully, a mobile defense, hit-and-run tactics, used the Bocage terrain to mask our movements. Precisely, Meyer confirmed. We divide our remaining panzers into 3 Kampftruppen battle groups of 10 tanks each. Each group operates independently, striking British spearheads, then withdrawing before they can concentrate forces against us. We maintain radio silence except for brief, coded transmissions. We make them believe they are facing a full-strength division conducting an organized defense. Through the periscope, Meyer observed the British advance. Sherman tanks advanced in a wide formation across an open field approximately 800 meters distant, their infantry following cautiously behind. The Allied artillery had lifted momentarily, waiting for their own forces to close the distance before resuming the bombardment. This was the moment Meyer had anticipated, the brief window when the British were most vulnerable, committed to the attack, but not yet consolidated. All units, Meyer transmitted, breaking radio silence. Engage at my command. Fire 3 rounds, then withdraw to secondary positions. Make them count. The 1st Panther emerged from concealment at the field's edge, its long 75mm gun already tracking the Sherman. The German tank fired, and the Sherman's turret separated from its hole in a shower of sparks and flame. Before the British could react, 2 more Panthers appeared from different positions, their guns speaking in rapid succession. 3 more Shermans erupted into funeral pyres within seconds. The British formation halted, their commanders uncertain whether they had stumbled into a prepared defensive line or a trap. That uncertainty, that moment of hesitation, was precisely what Meyer needed. His Panthers fired their 3rd rounds to hits. One missed and then reversed into the concealing shadows of the Bocage before British artillery could find their positions. Meyer checked his watch. 0-8-15 hours. The first engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes, cost the British 6 tanks, and confirmed to their commanders that German resistance remained formidable. 3 hours and 45 minutes remained. The radio crackled with a transmission from Kampftrupp Waldmüller. Contact with British armor in Sector 4. Engaging now? Seconds later, the distant rumble of tank guns echoed across the Norman countryside. Waldmüller's force was executing the same tactic: strike, damage, disappear. Historical analysis from military scholars indicates this type of mobile defense was among the most effective tactics available to numerically inferior forces, facing overwhelming firepower by refusing to present a static target and maintaining the initiative through rapid, violent counterattacks. German commanders could inflict disproportionate casualties while preserving their own forces. But Meyer knew the truth behind the tactical theory. Each engagement depleted his precious ammunition stocks. Each withdrawal surrendered territory. Each lost tank could not be replaced. 0900 hours arrived with the sound of hundreds of engines. The British Second Army, having absorbed the initial German counterattacks, regrouped and resumed their advance with renewed determination. From his position in a sunken lane between the hedgerows, Meyer watched through binoculars as the Allied forces deployed in overwhelming strength. This was not the cautious probing advance of the morning. This was the full weight of British armor and infantry pressing forward in a coordinated assault designed to crush any remaining resistance. Obersturmbannführer Winkler said quietly from the gunner's position, "They have learned our trick." He was correct. The British had adjusted their tactics. Instead of advancing in neat formations across open ground, they were pushing forward along multiple axes simultaneously, using their numerical superiority to present targets in every direction at once. Meyer could engage one thrust, perhaps 2, but a 3rd or 4th would flank his position before he could reposition. The mathematics of modern warfare were brutally simple. Superior numbers, properly employed, always prevailed. Meyer keyed his radio. "All Kampftruppen, this is Meyer. British are advancing in sector coordination. Execute scenario red fighting withdrawal to phase line Blau. Waldmüller, your group covers the northern route. Von Ribbentrop, Hold the crossroads at Muen for 30 minutes, then fall back. My group will engage the center thrust to buy time for both movements." The responses came quickly, professionally, without argument. These officers understood what Meyer was ordering, a calculated retreat under fire. One of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. Men would die buying those 30-minute intervals. Tanks would be sacrificed as rear guards. But the alternative was encirclement and annihilation. Meyer's command Panther surged forward from its concealment, positioning itself hull down behind a small rise where only the turret remained visible. To the approaching British, to his left and right, for more Panthers deployed similarly. Their guns spoke almost simultaneously, and the lead Sherman formation staggered under the impact of German 75mm shells. To Sherman's that immediately, 3 more slewed to halts with damaged tracks or transmissions. But the British did not retreat this time. They had learned from the morning's engagements. Within seconds, British artillery found Meyer's position, and the world dissolved into thunder and shrapnel. Earth geysers scoured all around the German tanks. A Panther to Meyer's right took a direct hit on its engine deck and began burning, its crew bailing out into the maelstrom of exploding shells. "Reverse, all units, reverse now," Meyer shouted into his microphone. Even as Kessler was already throwing the Panther into reverse gear, the tank backed down the slope at dangerous speed, its engine screaming in protest, while artillery continued to pound the position they had occupied seconds earlier. According to documentation from the Canadian Military Archives, the German defensive tactics employed during the Battle for Caen demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility. Despite overwhelming Allied material superiority, German commanders repeatedly frustrated Allied advances through aggressive use of armor in defensive roles. Though the cumulative casualties from these actions steadily depleted German combat strength, Meyer's battle group raced through a narrow farm lane, branches scraping against the Panther's hull, while British shells searched for them with mechanical precision. One of his tanks, lagging behind with mechanical problems, disappeared in a direct artillery strike before its crew could abandon the vehicle. Meyer forced himself not to look back, not to think about the 5 men who had ceased to exist in that single moment. The retreat continued through the Norman countryside, a running battle fought at hedgerow intersections and farm lanes. Each German position held just long enough to delay the British advance, before falling back to the next. 1000 hours. 2 hours gone, 2 hours remaining. Meyer's command Panther sat immobile in a grove of trees north of Franqueville, its engine ticking as it cooled from the brutal run through British artillery fire. The young commander climbed from the turret and dropped to the ground, his legs nearly buckling from exhaustion and nervous tension. Around him, the remnants of his battle group, now reduced to 7 operational tanks, arranged themselves in a hasty defensive perimeter. Hauptsturmführer Beck appeared from the trees, his uniform torn and darkened with someone else's blood. The operations officer had been coordinating the withdrawal from a half-track that had taken shrapnel 10 minutes earlier, killing the driver and wounding the radio operators. Beck himself bore a livid cut across his forehead, but seemed otherwise functional. "Status report," Meyer demanded, accepting a canteen of water from his loader and draining half of it in desperate gulps. Beck consulted a small notebook, his handwriting nearly illegible from the half-track's violent movements during the retreat. Kampfrup Waldmuller reports for tanks remaining. Currently withdrawing through Buren, British infantry has occupied the northern sectors. We evacuated. Kampfrup von Ribbentrop held Muen for 28 minutes before being forced out. They lost 3 tanks, but report destroying at least 8 British vehicles. They are moving to Faisaleinblau as ordered. Meyer did the mathematics in his head. From 30 operational tanks that morning, his command had been reduced to perhaps 15. They had delayed the British advance by approximately 90 minutes, destroyed or damaged perhaps 25 Allied vehicles, and surrendered 3 kilometers of territory that could never be reclaimed. In conventional terms, a successful defensive action. In practical terms, slow-motion annihilation. Ammunition status, Meyer asked, though he already suspected the answer. Critical, Beck confirmed. Most tanks report fewer than 15 main gun rounds remaining. Fuel is below 40% across all vehicles. We have exhausted our immediate supply. Cash, as everything else, is behind British lines now. The cold reality settled over Meyer like a shroud. Even if his division survived the next 2 hours, it would do so as a hollow shell incapable of further combat operations. The British had won not through tactical brilliance, but through the simple application of overwhelming material superiority. They could afford to lose 50 tanks destroying 30 German panzers. They could afford to expend 10,000 artillery shells to force a 3-kilometer retreat. They could afford everything except time, and Meyer had sold them hours at the cost of everything he commanded. A sudden commotion from the perimeter snapped Meyer from his dark thoughts. Two grenadiers appeared, half carrying a wounded soldier between them. The man's left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped through a hastily applied bandage around his torso. Obersturmbannführer, one of the grenadiers reported breathlessly. This man is from Sturmbannführer Waldmuller's group. He has a message. The wounded soldier, a young Unterscharfer who looked barely 20 years old, straightened as much as his injuries allowed. Sir, Sturmbannführer Waldmuller sends word British armor has broken through in the north. Multiple companies of Shermans and infantry. He is attempting to establish a blocking position, but requests immediate support. Meyer felt his exhausted mind shift into cold tactical analysis. If the northern sector collapsed, the British would achieve the breakthrough they sought, rendering all morning's sacrifices meaningless. Meyer made his decision with the practiced speed of a veteran commander who understood that perfect solutions did not exist in warfare, only choices between various degrees of disaster. Waldmuller's position had to be reinforced, but stripping his own battle group would leave the center exposed. The solution, therefore, required accepting risk in both sectors while maximizing the shock value of his remaining forces. Beck established radio contact with von Ribbentrop. His battle group is to move immediately to support Waldmuller's position maximum speed, ignore flank security. They engaged the British breakthrough at all costs. Meyer turned to his own tank commanders, who had gathered around the command vehicle. We hold here for 30 minutes to fix British attention on the center, then withdraw to phase line Blau. Make them believe we are the main defensive position. Obersturmführer Dietrich, commander of Meyer's 2nd platoon, voiced the question hovering in every man's mind. And if von Ribbentrop cannot stop the breakthrough, then we have delayed the inevitable by a few more hours, Meyer answered with brutal honesty. But those hours may be enough for the 7th Army to establish coherent defenses to the south. That is the mission. That has always been the mission. The officers dispersed to their vehicles without further questions. They were SS Panzer men, volunteers who had sworn oaths and accepted sacrifices that conventional soldiers could scarcely imagine. They would execute orders until their tanks burned or their ammunition ran empty, because that was what they had trained to do, what they believed in doing, regardless of whether victory remained possible. Meyer climbed back into his Panther's turret, settling into the commander's seat with the weary familiarity of a man returning home. Winkler sat at the gunner's position, making minute adjustments to the sight while Schmidt organized their remaining ammunition. 14 armor-piercing rounds and 7 high-explosive shells. Kessler already had the engine running, reading the RPM gauge with the focused intensity of a man whose skill determined whether his crew lived or died. Positions, Meyer commanded, and the battle group's tanks spread out along the tree line, each commander selecting firing positions that offered maximum concealment. While covering the most likely British approach routes, the young Panzer leader focused his binoculars on the southern horizon, where smoke columns marked the British advance. Historical records from British after-action reports indicate that at approximately 10:30 hours on the 4th of July, 1944, advance elements of the 3rd British Infantry Division encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance from German armor near Franqueville. The British advance slowed as commanders requested additional artillery support, concerned that intelligence regarding German strength had been significantly underestimated. 1100 hours, the deadline Meyer had calculated. That morning approached with mechanical inevitability. The British came on through the Norman fields with the confidence of victors who understood mathematics as well as tactics. Sherman tanks advanced in platoon strength, infantry following in carriers, artillery preparation walking ahead of them in precisely timed patterns. This was modern industrial warfare at its most efficient. Overwhelming force applied with professional competence against an enemy whose only remaining assets were courage and tactical skill. Range 800 meters, Winkler reported calmly. Target lead Sherman. Hold fire, Meyer ordered, watching the British formation spread across his front. 6 Shermans, 12 infantry carriers, supporting elements. Let them commit. Wait for my command. The second stretched, eternal and terrible, while the British tanks advanced into effective range. Meyer felt, rather than saw, the tension in his crew. Winkler's finger hovering over the firing mechanism. Schmidt ready to slam the next round into the breech. Kessler prepared to throw the Panther into reverse the instant after firing. Fire! The Panther's 75mm gun recoiled violently, and 800 meters distant, the lead Sherman's turret lifted into the air on a pillar of flame before crashing back onto the burning hull. Along the tree line, 6 more German guns spoke almost simultaneously, and the British formation staggered under the impact. 4 Shermans died in the opening salvo. 1 more slewed sideways with a broken track, the remaining vehicle reversing frantically while its crew searched desperately for their invisible attackers. But Meyer had been fighting the British long enough to anticipate their response. Within 90 seconds, counter-battery radar had identified the German firing positions, and Allied artillery began its methodical reply. The first shells arrived with screaming precision, exploding among the trees where Meyer's tanks had taken position. Splinters of wood and hot metal sleeted through the air. A Panther 20 meters to Meyer's left took a direct hit and erupted into flames, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that sent the turret cartwheeling through the trees. "Reverse, all units, execute withdrawal," Meyer transmitted, even as Kessler was already backing their Panther away from the tree line at maximum speed. The forest around them, transformed into hell trees exploding under artillery impact, earth fountaining skyward, the air itself seeming to burn with concussive force. Meyer's command tank burst from the tree line into open ground, its tracks throwing up dirt as Kessler executed a pivot turn that would have impressed any instructor at the Panzer training schools. The remaining tanks of his battle group followed, 5 Panthers racing across Norman farmland while British artillery pursued them. With mechanical fury, 1 tank, slower than the others, disappeared in a massive explosion that left only a smoking crater. The young commander forced himself to focus on the road ahead, rather than the burning vehicles behind. Sentiment, regret, grief, these were luxuries he could not afford. While men still depended on his decisions, through the Panther's vision blocks, Meyer could see the spire of a church marking Frankfurtville, their next offensive position. Less than 1 kilometer distant, radio traffic crackled with desperate transmissions. Von Ribbentrop's voice, usually so controlled, carried an edge of barely contained panic. "This is von Ribbentrop to Meyer, British armor strength. Greater than estimated, we are heavily engaged." The transmission dissolved into static punctuated by the distinctive sound of tank guns firing at close range. Beck's voice cut through the chaos with professional precision. Von Ribbentrop reports contact with at least 30 British tanks near Buren. Kampfgruppe Waldmuller has been pushed back to the village outskirts. British are executing flanking maneuvers on both groups. Meyer absorbed this information while his Panther raced toward Frankfurtville. At 40 kilometers per hour, its suspension protesting violently over the rough terrain. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond his ability to influence significantly. Von Ribbentrop and Waldmuller were fighting separate battles against overwhelming odds, buying time with the only currency they possessed, the lives of their men and the steel of their tanks. Documentary evidence from the National World War II Museum archives indicates that during the afternoon of the 4th of July, 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division conducted a fighting withdrawal against vastly superior British forces, inflicting significant casualties while preserving a core of experienced personnel who would later reform the division. The historical assessment suggests this represented one of the more skillfully executed defensive actions of the Normandy campaign. Though it could not alter the strategic outcome, Meyer's battle group, now reduced to 4 operational tanks, reached the outskirts of Frankfurtville at 1100 hours precisely. His deadline had arrived with clockwork precision. The young Panzer commander had held for 4 hours as ordered, delayed the British advance, inflicted casualties, preserved some portion of his division, and it had cost him everything: 26 tanks destroyed, hundreds of men dead or wounded, and the certain knowledge that his division no longer existed as an effective fighting force. In the shadow of Frankfurtville's ancient church, Kurt Meyer finally allowed himself to stop. His command Panther sat motionless in the village square, its engine ticking as it cooled, while the young commander climbed stiffly from the turret for what might be the final time. Around him, the remnants of what had been 3 full battle groups gathered in exhausted clusters, perhaps 8 tanks total, fewer than 200 grenadiers, the scattered survivors of a division that had ceased to exist. Waldmuller arrived first, his face blackened with smoke and dried blood, leading a column of walking wounded and a single operational Panther. Von Ribbentrop appeared minutes later, his reconnaissance vehicle shot to pieces, but his command tank intact. Through what could only be described as miraculous luck, the 3 officers met in the church's doorway without ceremony or formal military courtesy, just 3 exhausted men who had survived another impossible day. "The British will be here within the hour," Von Ribbentrop reported flatly. They are consolidating their positions, bringing up fresh units. We hurt them today, but they can afford what we cost them. Meyer nodded slowly, unsurprised by this assessment. Through the morning's fighting, his improvised battle groups had destroyed perhaps 40 Allied tanks and inflicted several hundred casualties. By the cold mathematics of warfare, a respectable defensive action. But the British had lost perhaps 5% of their attacking force, while Meyer's division had lost 80% of its combat strength. Victory belonged to those who could afford their losses, and Germany could afford nothing anymore. Orders from High Command, Waldmuller asked, though the question was mere formality. All three officers knew that High Command existed somewhere far from Norman hedgerows, issuing directives based on maps that bore little relationship to ground truth. Beck appeared from the church interior, where he had established a temporary command post with their last functioning radio. High Command acknowledges our situation. We are ordered to continue delaying actions while falling back to phase line Schwartz. He paused, meeting Meyer's eyes with an expression that conveyed everything words could not. Approximately 15 kilometers south. No mention of relief forces or reinforcements. We are on our own. Meyer accepted this information with the same fatalistic calm that had carried him through for years of war. The German army in the West was dying, had been dying since the 6th of June when Allied forces had stormed ashore on Norman beaches. With resources that dwarfed anything Germany could deploy, what remained was not victory or even survival, but the manner of dying, whether with honor and skill or in panic dissolution. Gentlemen, Meyer said quietly, addressing the assembled officers and senior NCOs who had gathered to hear the commander's final orders. 4 hours ago, I told you our division would cease to exist by 1100 hours. I was wrong. We still exist, if barely. Some of you will survive this day, perhaps even this war. When you do, remember what we accomplished here. We were ordered to hold an impossible position against overwhelming force. We held it. We were told to delay the British advance. We delayed it. We did our duty as soldiers, regardless of the cause we served or the leadership that betrayed us. He paused, seeing in their faces the same exhausted determination he felt in his own soul. These were not the screaming fanatics of propaganda films or the monsters of Allied intelligence reports. They were soldiers who had volunteered for an elite unit, survived years of brutal combat, and learned late that courage and skill could not overcome industrial might and numerical superiority. We will withdraw to phase line Schwartz in good order, Meyer continued. Those tanks that cannot be moved will be destroyed. Wounded will be evacuated first. We leave no man behind who can be saved and no equipment intact for the enemy. Is that understood? The response came as a unified acknowledgement from men who no longer had the energy for military formality, but retained the discipline that had kept them alive this long. By 1200 hours on the 4th of July, 1944, the remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had withdrawn from Franqueville. British forces occupied the village by 1300 hours, continuing their advance toward Caen against German resistance. That grew weaker with each passing day. Kurt Meyer would survive the war, stand trial for war crimes, and spend years in prison before his eventual release. The division he had commanded with such skill and determination would be rebuilt, destroyed again, and rebuilt once more before Germany's final defeat in May 1945. But in that Norman village on an overcast July afternoon, as the last German tanks disappeared toward the south, and British soldiers moved cautiously through streets,